Lieutenant Jake Murdoch was having what the rest of the galaxy would call a terrible day, but what he'd call a Tuesday. He sat in the back row of advanced combat theory, surrounded by aliens who looked like they'd been designed by a committee of science fiction writers who couldn't agree on anything. To his left was Rolf, a 7-foot-tall saurian whose scales shimmered purple when he was feeling smug, which was always. To his right, his only actual friend, a gelatinous blob named Pip, who communicated through anxious bubbling sounds and somehow still managed to pass every written exam. The Galactic Combat Academy on Station Kepler 9 was supposedly the most prestigious military training facility in known space. Jake suspected it was mostly prestigious because it was expensive and far away from anything useful. The station floated in the middle of nowhere, which the brochure called strategically positioned but really meant, if you wash out, good luck getting home. At the front of the classroom stood Professor Quillnax, a 4-armed insectoid from Chitrix Prime, who had made it his personal mission to remind Jake that humans were, quote, a statistically improbable accident of evolution that somehow achieved spaceflight before self-extinction. Quillnax's mandibles clicked together when he talked, which made everything he said sound vaguely threatening, even when he was discussing lunch options in the cafeteria. Today was Energy Weapons Day. Jake could tell because Quillnax had worn his fancy teaching vest, the one with all 6 pockets for different types of plasma cartridges. Show off. Today, Quillnax announced, his voice carrying that special tone of condescension reserved for substitute teachers and people who think insects are better than mammals. We will be conducting live combat simulations using only energy-based weaponry. Plasma rifles, photon blasters, ion cannons. The tools of civilized warfare. Rolf's scales flickered with excitement. The lizard loved energy weapons the way some people loved fancy coffee. He'd probably sleep with his plasma rifle if the Academy allowed it, which they didn't, which Jake knew because Rolf had tried and gotten written up. Pip bubbled nervously, which was his default state. Jake was pretty sure Pip's species had evolved anxiety as a survival mechanism. It seemed to be working. They were still around. Each of you will face the training hologram, Quillnax continued, gesturing with 2 of his 4 arms while the other 2 clasped behind his back in what he probably thought was a dignified pose. You will demonstrate your proficiency with advanced energy weaponry. You will show me that you understand the principles of modern combat. And you, Lieutenant Murdoch, will hopefully avoid embarrassing your entire species more than usual. The class chittered, barked, and buzzed with laughter. Jake had heard worse. Last week, Rolf had called him the monkey with good aim, which was actually kind of a compliment if you thought about it. Monkeys had excellent aim. That's why they were so good at throwing their own feces at zoo visitors. Jake raised his hand. Quillnax's antennae drooped. What is it, Murdoch? Can I use alternative historical weaponry? The room went quiet. Even Pip stopped bubbling. Quillnax's mandibles spread into what might have been a smile if you were feeling generous, or a threat display if you were being honest. Alternative historical weaponry? You mean your primitive human tools? Your sticks and rocks and sharpened metals? Something like that, yeah. The professor's laugh sounded like a garbage disposal trying to eat a fork. Class, this is what we call a learning opportunity. Lieutenant Murdoch wants to demonstrate why his species spent 10,000 years hitting each other with clubs before discovering electricity. Very well. I'll make you a deal, human. Jake waited. Deals with Quillnax usually ended poorly, but he was committed now. If you can defeat the combat simulation with your primitive toy, I will never assign homework again for the remainder of the semester. The class erupted. No homework was the dream. Rolf's scales were strobing like a disco ball. Quillnax held up a hand. However, when you fail, and you will fail, you will write me a 10,000-word essay on why humans are evolutionally inferior. Single-spaced. Proper citations. Due Monday. Jake stood up. Deal. Pip bubbled in a way that definitely meant, are you insane? Which was fair, because Jake probably was. Professor Quillnax rubbed his 4 hands together, which was twice as menacing as when humans did it. Excellent. Let us begin with the standard demonstrations, and save Lieutenant Murdoch's inevitable humiliation for dessert. The next 20 minutes were a parade of alien competence that would have been impressive if everyone wasn't so annoyingly smug about it. Rolf went first, naturally, because he'd probably elbowed 3 smaller students out of the way to get to the front. He wielded a plasma rifle like it was an extension of his own body, which made sense because his people had been using them for 2,000 years. The training hologram, a standard Vraxian war beast, lasted about 15 seconds before Rolf dissolved it into pixels and smugness. Adequate, Quillnax said, which in professor speak meant, excellent, but I'll never admit it. A crystalline student whose name Jake couldn't pronounce went next, using some kind of photon whip that looked like it had been designed by someone who really liked both lasers and Indiana Jones. Effective, flashy, probably impossible to use without taking off your own leg. The hologram lasted 12 seconds. Pip went third, somehow wielding an ion cannon that was 3 times his body mass, by absorbing it into his gelatinous form. The blob creature's natural nervousness actually helped his aim, since he was constantly vibrating and the cannon's spread fire pattern compensated for it. 10 seconds. The class gave him a polite ripple of acknowledgement, which for Pip was basically a standing ovation. Then it was Jake's turn. He walked to his locker at the back of the training hall while everyone watched. The metal door opened with a hiss that sounded way more dramatic than it needed to be. Inside, among his standard-issue academy gear, energy shield generator, and a lunchbox his mom had packed with enough protein bars to survive a siege, was the thing his grandmother had insisted he take to space. Jake pulled out the katana. The silence was immediate and total. Even the station's air recyclers seemed to pause out of sheer confusion. The sword was about 3 feet of folded steel, wrapped handle, slight curve to the blade. It sat in a black lacquered scabbard that had seen better centuries. Jake's great-great-great-grandfather had carried it in some war nobody remembered anymore. His great-great-grandfather had carried it in another war. His grandfather had kept it on the wall. His grandmother had shoved it into Jake's hands at the spaceport and said, "Take something practical." At the time, Jake had thought she meant practical like a good jacket. Now he realized she'd meant practical like a backup plan. He walked back to the training area. Every eye, sensor, and optical organ in the room tracked him. Professor Quillnax's antennae perked up. "That is a sharpened metal bar." "It's a katana," Jake said. "It doesn't even have a power cell." "That's because it doesn't need one." Rolf let out a barking laugh that sounded like a seal choking on its own superiority complex. "You brought a kitchen knife to advanced combat theory." "It's not a kitchen knife." "Does it require electricity?" "No." "Does it fire projectiles?" "No." "Then it's a kitchen knife." Rolf's scales were doing that purple shimmer thing again. "Or maybe a letter opener for very large letters." The class erupted in laughter. Someone in the back, Jake couldn't see who, started making swish-swish noises, like they were mimicking a child playing with a stick. Pip bubbled something that Jake's translator rendered as supportive but concerned gurgling. Jake unsheathed the blade. The sound of steel sliding against wood cut through the laughter like a sword. "It's approximately 800 years old. Family heirloom. My grandmother said I should take something that wouldn't break down in space." "Your grandmother," Quillnax said slowly, savoring each word like he was tasting a fine wine made of concentrated condescension, "sent you to the most advanced combat academy in the galaxy with a medieval stabbing implement. She's a practical woman. She's a delusional woman if she thinks that relic will serve any purpose beyond opening packages." Jake tested the weight of the blade. Still balanced, still sharp, still exactly as useful as the day it was forged, which was more than he could say for half the energy weapons in this room that needed charging every 4 hours. "So we have a deal, right?" "I win. No homework?" Quillnax's mandibles spread wide. "Oh, we have a deal, human. And I'm going to enjoy reading your essay." He turned to the hologram control panel. "Maximum difficulty, I think. No need to make this quick." "Professor, that setting is usually reserved for final exams," Pip bubbled nervously. "Yes, well, Lieutenant Murdoch wanted to use historical weaponry. Let's give him a historical beating." Quillnax's 4 fingers danced across the controls. The air in the training area shimmered, pixelated, and then solidified into something that made several students step back involuntarily. The Vraxian war beast stood 12 feet tall, covered in interlocking armor plates that could deflect small arms fire. Its 6 limbs ended in energy claws that glowed blue with contained plasma. Its head was mostly teeth and targeting sensors. The Academy used Vraxian holograms because actual Vraxian war beasts were illegal in 14 star systems due to being extremely good at turning other things into corpses. Rolf whistled, which sounded like wind through a cave full of smug lizards. "Oh, you're dead." Jake stepped into the training circle, katana held loosely at his side. "Probably. Definitely," Quillnax corrected. "Simulation begins in 3, 2, 1. The war beast's eyes lit up red. Jake smiled. This was going to be fun. The Vraxian war beast didn't roar. That would have been too biological, too emotional. Instead, it emitted a targeting lock sound that was just a flat, mechanical beep, because nothing says "I'm about to kill you" like the universe's most dispassionate notification tone. Jake stood there, sword held in a low guard position that his kendo instructor would have called adequate, and his grandmother would have called, "Stop embarrassing the family." The entire class leaned forward. Even the students who'd been pretending not to care were suddenly very interested in watching the human get obliterated. Quillnax folded all 4 arms across his chest. "Any last words before your primitive weapon meets advanced technology?" "Yeah," Jake said. "One question. Does the hologram have the same weak points as a real Vraxian war beast?" "Of course. Accuracy is essential for proper training." "Cool. Just checking." The professor's antennae twitched. "Why would that matter? You can't possibly know Vraxian anatomy better than your plasma-wielding classmates." Jake shifted his stance slightly, weight on his back foot, sword angled across his body. "My classmates have been training with energy weapons for what, 5 years? 10 if they're overachievers? Your point? My species has been killing things with swords for 3,000 years. We got really good at it." Rolf's scales flickered. 3,000 years of being primitive, you mean? 3,000 years of practice, Jake corrected. "See, the thing about energy weapons is, they're great. Point, shoot, thing dies. Very efficient. But you know what happens when your plasma rifle runs out of charge in the middle of a fight. You reload," someone called from the back. "And while you're reloading, you're vulnerable. You know what happens when a sword runs out of charge?" Silence. Nothing. Because swords don't run out of charge. They just keep working until someone takes them away from you. And good luck with that, because the person holding the sword is generally pretty attached to it. Literally. Pip bubbled something encouraging, though his translation matrix couldn't quite capture the sentiment. It came out as, "Wobble wobble support wobble." Quillnax clicked his mandibles impatiently. "Fascinating historical context, Lieutenant. None of it will help you against a war beast that can tear through reinforced hull plating." "We'll see." Jake rolled his shoulders, loosened his grip slightly. The katana felt right in his hands. 800 years old, and it still felt right. His grandmother knew what she was doing. "Begin simulation," Quillnax announced. The war beast moved. Not charged, not lunged, moved. 1 second it was 12 feet away, the next it was 8 feet away. Energy claws already swiping toward Jake's center mass with enough force to cut a shuttle in half. Jake wasn't there anymore. He'd shifted left, not dramatically. Not with the kind of flashy combat roll the Academy taught. Just a simple step, weight transfer. Body angling so the claw passed through the space where his torso had been approximately half a second ago. The class made a collective sound of surprise that the translator couldn't quite process. It came out as confused, chittering mixed with impressed gurgling. "Lucky," Rolf muttered, but his scales had shifted to a color Jake didn't recognize. Maybe uncertainty, maybe respect, probably constipation. The war beast recalculated, its combat computer processing the miss and adjusting its next attack pattern. It fired a burst of plasma bolts from its shoulder-mounted cannons, 3 shots in a tight, triangle pattern designed to box in the target and eliminate dodging options. Jake moved again, not away from the shots. Between them. His body twisted, sword coming up not to block but to deflect, the flat of the blade angling one plasma bolt just enough that it missed by inches. The other 2 shots went wide because Jake was suddenly in motion, not retreating but advancing, closing the distance while the beast's targeting system tried to track him. "That's impossible," someone whispered. "The targeting computer should predict movement patterns." Jake slid under another claw swipe, blade flashing out. The katana caught the war beast's leg joint, the gap between armor plates where biological tissue or mechanical actuators would be on a real Vraxian. The hologram sparked, stumbled slightly. First blood. Or first pixels, whatever. Quillnax's mandibles opened and closed rapidly. A tick Jake had learned meant the professor was recalculating something. "Lucky hit. The simulation will adapt to your primitive flailing." "It's not flailing," Jake said, still moving, still staying just inside the beast's optimal attack range, but outside its grab range. "It's called footwork. We invented it around the same time you guys were still figuring out photosynthesis." The war beast went into assault mode, all 6 limbs attacking in a coordinated pattern that would have turned a normal opponent into chunky salsa. Claws, plasma bolts, a tail swipe that could dent a tank. Jake flowed through it. There was no other word for it. He wasn't dodging in the clinical, calculated way the Academy taught. He was moving like water, like his body knew where the attacks were going before the combat computer did. "How is he doing that?" Rolf's voice had lost all its smugness. Now he just sounded confused. Pip provided the answer, bubbling excitedly. The translator rendered it as, "Unpredictable movement, no computer pattern, very scary, much impressive. Wow." Jake ducked under a claw, stepped inside, the beast's guard, and drove the katana up through the gap in its chest armor. The blade sank in 6 inches, right where a Vraxian's primary heart would be. The hologram froze, damage assessment algorithms processing the hit. Then it dissolved into pixels. Simulation time, 47 seconds. The training hall was dead silent. Jake flicked the blade once, a completely unnecessary move he'd learned from too many movies, and sheathed the katana with a soft click. He turned to Professor Quillnax. "So," Jake said, "about that homework?" Actually, that wasn't quite how it happened. Jake had gotten a little ahead of himself in the retelling. The war beast didn't dissolve after the chest hit. It did freeze for half a second, damage assessment protocols engaging, but Quillnax had set the difficulty to maximum, which meant the hologram had adaptive armor and redundant systems. Because Vraxians were paranoid enough to evolve backup organs for their backup organs, the beast's eyes flared brighter red. Angry red. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me, red. Insufficient damage for termination," the computer announced in that cheerful voice that all training computers seem to have. "Simulation continuing." "Of course it is," Jake muttered, pulling the blade free and backstepping as the war beast's claws came around in a retaliatory swipe that would have taken his head off if he'd been slower or stupider or both. Rolf was practically vibrating with excitement now, scales cycling through colors like a mood ring having an identity crisis. This is impossible. Melee weapons cannot penetrate Vraxian armor plating. They can if you know where the joints are. Jake called out, currently occupied with not dying. "We've been fighting in armor for 3,000 years. You learn things." The war beast launched into phase 2 of its attack pattern, which the Academy manual called aggressive suppression, but which Jake called throw everything at the target and hope something sticks. Plasma bolts saturated the air, energy claws carved through space in overlapping patterns, and the beast's tail added a third dimension of "please stop trying to kill me" to the equation. Jake didn't have an energy shield. He'd left it in his locker because shields needed charging and made a distinctive humming sound that attracted attention. The katana didn't hum. It didn't glow. It didn't broadcast its position to every sensor in the room. It was just there, an absence of technology in a room full of it, and that made it invisible to the systems designed to track energy signatures. Jake used that. He moved through the plasma fire not by calculating angles and trajectories, but by reading the beast's body language, where it shifted its weight, where its eyes focused, the tiny microsecond delays between thought and action that every living thing had, even holograms programmed to simulate living things. "His movement pattern makes no sense," someone in the class said. It might have been one of the Mantis people from Sector 7. They were big on logical combat algorithms. "The computer cannot predict his next position. That's because he's not moving optimally," another student added. "He's wasting energy on unnecessary motion." Jake slid under another claw strike, came up inside the beast's guard again, and opened a deep cut along its left flank where the armor plates overlapped. "I'm not being optimal. I'm being unpredictable." The beast shrieked, a sound that was definitely not in the standard Vraxian war beast audio file. Quillnax had added custom sound effects. Overachiever. "Your computers calculate the most efficient path from point A to point B." Jake continued, because apparently fighting for his life wasn't enough. He also needed to provide running commentary like a nature documentary narrator. "They predict where I should go based on optimal survival odds." He feinted left, went right, and the beast's claws tore through empty air. "But I'm not a bad computer. I'm a human. We're not optimal. We're creative and stupid, and we make decisions that don't make mathematical sense because sometimes the best choice is the one nobody expects." Pip was bouncing now, literally bouncing, his gelatinous form vibrating with what the translator called excessive enthusiastic support, wobbling. The war beast adapted again, this time trying to create distance, backing up to get Jake into optimal firing range, where the plasma cannons would have clean shots. Jake didn't let it. He advanced, staying close, uncomfortably close, inside the minimum targeting range that the beast's weapon systems needed to function properly. Energy weapons were amazing at medium to long range. At point-blank range, they were expensive clubs that occasionally exploded. "That's cheating," Rolf protested. "It's tactics," Jake corrected, ducking under the beast's attempt to grab him with both upper claws. "We call it getting inside their OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. If I move faster than you can complete the cycle, you're always reacting instead of acting." The beast tried to bite him, massive jaws snapping closed on air as Jake rolled to the side. He came up with the katana already moving, blade catching the beast's right foreleg at the joint, cutting through actuators or tendons or whatever holograms had instead of anatomy. The limb spasmed, went limp. 5 functional limbs left. "This is insane," someone whispered. "He's winning." "He's not winning." Quillnax snapped, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. His antennae were drooping, which Jake had learned meant the professor was having doubts about something, usually his life choices. He's merely prolonging his inevitable defeat. Sure, Professor, sure. The war beast went berserk. That was the technical term, according to the Academy manual. Phase 3 of the combat simulation. Overwhelming aggression with disregard for self-preservation. In practice, it meant the beast started breaking things, including large chunks of the training hall floor, in an attempt to catch Jake in the collateral damage. Plasma bolts carved gouges in the walls. Energy claws tore through reinforced flooring. The beast's tail smashed into a support pillar hard enough to make the entire room shake. Jake used the chaos. He grabbed a chunk of debris, threw it at the beast's face. Not to hurt it, just to distract it for half a second. The beast's targeting computer locked onto the projectile, classified it as a threat, and fired. The plasma bolt vaporized the debris and kept going, straight into the support pillar behind Jake, which collapsed spectacularly and created a cascade of falling metal and synthetic stone that the beast had to process and react to. Half a second. That's all Jake needed. He was already moving, already inside the beast's guard again, katana coming up in a rising cut that caught the beast's left arm at the shoulder joint. The limb didn't quite separate, but it hung uselessly, sparking and glitching. 4 functional limbs. The beast lunged, trying to crush Jake with its bulk. 3 tons of holographic war machine coming down like a meteor made of rage and poor life choices. Jake stepped aside at the last possible moment. The beast crashed into the wall behind him, hard enough that the impact sensors in the training hall registered structural damage and started bleeding warning sirens. It tried to recover, tried to turn, but momentum was a harsh mistress, and even holograms had to obey physics. Jake didn't hesitate. He moved in, blade flashing in the overhead lights, and drove the katana through the gap in the beast's neck armor where the spine connected to the skull. The hologram froze. The warning sirens stopped. Every eye in the room locked onto the human standing on top of a 12-foot war beast with an 800-year-old sword buried in its brain. Simulation terminated. The computer announced cheerfully. Victory, Lieutenant Murdoch. Time elapsed. 47 seconds. Damage sustained. 0. Style points. Recalculating error. Does not compute. Jake pulled the blade free, wiped it on his pants out of habit even though holograms didn't bleed, and sheathed it with a soft click. He turned to face the class. Nobody said anything. Even Rolf's scales had gone completely neutral gray, the color of deep confusion and existential crisis. Pip broke the silence with a bubble that the translator rendered as, "That was amazing, can you teach me? I don't have arms, but I'm willing to learn." Jake stepped down from the dissolving hologram and walked back to where Professor Quillnax stood, all 4 arms hanging limply at his sides. "So," Jake said again. "About that homework?" Professor Quillnax's mandibles worked silently, opening and closing like he was trying to chew through the reality of what he'd just witnessed. His antennae drooped so low they were practically dragging on the floor. One of his hands reached out to steady himself against the control panel. That, he finally managed, was a statistical anomaly. Was it though? Jake asked, still holding the katana loosely at his side. Because I'm pretty sure statistics don't account for 3,000 years of evolutionary pressure favoring the humans who were really good at stabbing things. You simply exploited weaknesses in the simulation. Programming. No, I exploited weaknesses in Vraxian anatomy. There's a difference. Jake held up the sword, letting the overhead lights catch the edge. You know what this is, Professor? Quillnax's antennae twitched irritably. A primitive metal blade that by all logical assessment should have failed catastrophically against advanced holographic combat systems. Wrong. This is a weapon that predates your civilization. The room went even quieter, which Jake hadn't thought was possible since it was already library silent. But apparently there were degrees of silence, and the class had just found a new one. Jake started pacing, which he'd seen professors do when they wanted to make a point. It seemed to work because everyone's eyes followed him. While your species was still figuring out how to make fire, humans were already forging steel. While you were inventing the wheel, we were inventing 17 different ways to kill someone with a sharpened piece of metal. We got really good at it because the humans who weren't good at it died. And the humans who were good at it had children who inherited their being good at stabbing things genes. Rolf raised a claw hesitantly. But energy weapons are objectively superior in every measurable metric. Are they? Jake stopped pacing. Let me ask you something. How long does your plasma rifle hold a charge? 4 hours of continuous operation, 6 if I'm conservative with shots. And then? Then I reload with a fresh power cell, which takes how long? Rolf's scales flickered uncertainly. 8 seconds for a field reload. 15 if I'm being tactical about it. 8 seconds. In a real fight, 8 seconds is forever. 8 seconds is enough time for someone to cross 30 meters and introduce you to the business end of a sharpened metal bar. Jake held up the katana again. This sword? It's been working continuously for 800 years. No recharging, no power cells, no batteries, just physics and metallurgy. A crystalline student raised what might have been a hand. But the energy output differential doesn't matter if you can't hit me. Jake pointed at the dissolved hologram. That war beast had targeting computers, threat assessment algorithms, predictive movement software, every advantage technology could provide. And it lost because it was fighting something its systems weren't designed to handle. Me. Pip bubbled enthusiastically. The translator rendered it as, "Preach, human friend, preach." Jake continued, warming to his subject now. Your energy weapons are amazing. I'm not disputing that. Point, shoot, target vaporized. Very clean, very efficient. But you know what they also are? Predictable. He moved to the control panel, pulled up the combat replay hologram. Watch. Every plasma bolt travels in a straight line at a consistent velocity. Every energy blast has a charge-up time that creates a distinctive sound and light signature. Every ion beam leaves a tracer that tells everyone exactly where it came from. Your weapons announce themselves. The replay showed Jake moving through the plasma fire, the bolts streaming past him in glowing lines of orange and blue. A sword doesn't announce itself. There's no muzzle flash, no energy signature, no sound until it's already cutting through whatever it's aimed at. And the arc? The trajectory? Jake drew the katana again, moved through a slow cut. No computer can calculate this because there's no algorithm. It depends on my strength, my angle, my grip pressure, whether I had breakfast this morning, whether my shoulders sore. 1,000 variables that change moment to moment. Quillnax finally found his voice, though it came out smaller than usual. The principles of modern warfare are built on assumptions. Jake sheathed the blade. You assume everyone's using technology. You assume everyone's following the optimal tactical doctrine. You assume that 800 years of human trial and error in close combat is less valuable than 80 years of energy weapon development. It should be, Quillnax insisted, but he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. Should and is are two different things, Professor. You set that simulation to maximum difficulty because you thought I'd fail. You wanted me to fail. You wanted to prove that human weapons, human tactics, human thinking was obsolete. Jake walked back to his seat, katana resting across his lap. But here's the thing about humans. We don't become obsolete. We adapt. You gave us energy weapons and we learned to use them better than species who'd had them for centuries. You gave us spaceships and we turned them into exploration vessels, cargo haulers, and probably a few things that violate station regulations. You give us rules and we find the exceptions. You give us simulations and we break them. Rolf's scales had shifted to a color Jake had never seen before. Deep purple with gold flecks. Respect, maybe. Or indigestion. Hard to tell with saurians. This sword has killed more things than your entire family line, Professor. And it's never run out of batteries. It's never needed a firmware update. It's never been incompatible with the local atmosphere or gravity well. It just works, the same way it's worked for 3,000 years. Because sometimes the old ways aren't primitive. Sometimes they're just proven. Jake stood up, walked to the front of the class, and very deliberately placed the katana on Quillnax's desk. Also, it never needs reloading. You might want to add that to your advanced combat theory curriculum. Chapter 17. Why underestimating low-tech solutions will get you killed. I'll write the first draft if you want. No charge. He turned back to the stunned class. Oh, and Professor? Quillnax's antennae perked up slightly. Yes? Class dismissed? For a long moment, the professor just stared at the sword on his desk, then at Jake, then back at the sword. His mandibles clicked once, twice, 3 times. Class dismissed, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. No homework. For the rest of the semester. As agreed, the room erupted. The eruption lasted approximately 15 seconds before Quillnax's 4 hands slammed down on his desk hard enough to make the katana jump. However, he announced, voice recovering some of its professorial authority, I expect a 5-page analysis of today's combat engagement from each of you, except Lieutenant Murdoch. He's apparently too busy rewriting military doctrine to do homework. Jake grinned. I can live with that. The class filed out in a daze, the kind of confused shuffling that happened when everything you thought you knew turned out to be negotiable. Rolf lingered near the door, scales doing a complicated color pattern that Jake's cultural database identified as embarrassment, mixed with curiosity and a side of wounded pride. Murdoch, the Saurian said finally. Rolf. That was. He paused, searching for words. That was not terrible. Coming from Rolf, that was basically a marriage proposal. Jake decided to be gracious. Thanks. Could you? Another pause. Rolf's scales went full embarrassment purple. Could you teach me? The sword thing? Jake picked up his katana from Quilnax's desk, checked it for damage out of habit. Still perfect. Still sharp. Still 800 years of family legacy that had just won him a semester without homework. Sure. First lesson's free. Really? Second lesson costs 1 formal apology for every time you called me monkey with good aim. Rolf's scales flickered through several colors before settling on sheepish violet. That's going to be expensive. Yeah, well, quality education doesn't come cheap. Jake headed for the door where Pip was waiting, vibrating with excitement that had reached concerning frequencies. You coming, Pip? The blob creature bounced, which was his version of an enthusiastic yes. His translator matrix was working overtime. Do humans have weapons for beings without appendages? I wish to learn the ancient ways of stabbing. I have much enthusiasm. Very stab. Such blade. Jake considered this. Ever heard of a flail? What is flail? It's basically a weight on a chain. You swing it around until it hits something important. No hands required. Just commitment, and a complete disregard for your own safety. Pip's bubbling reached ultrasonic frequencies. The translator gave up and just displayed excitement overload in flashing text. They left the training hall together, an unlikely trio. A human with an ancient sword, a nervous blob creature dreaming of medieval weaponry, and a 7-foot lizard having an identity crisis about his entire approach to combat. Behind them, Professor Quilnax stood alone in the empty classroom, staring at the combat replay hologram. The human's movements traced patterns in the air, inefficient by every tactical metric, wasteful of energy, suboptimal in execution, and completely, devastatingly effective. He pulled up the course syllabus on his datapad. Advanced Combat Theory. Week 17 was currently listed as Energy Weapon Maintenance and Optimization. His 4 fingers hovered over the edit function. Then he started typing. Week 17, Pre-Energy Warfare Tactics. Guest Lecturer, Lieutenant Jake Murdoch. Topic: Why 3,000 years of evolution beats 80 years of engineering. Subtitle: Stop underestimating things just because they're old, you idiots. He paused, deleted the subtitle. Too unprofessional. He retyped it. Practical applications of historical combat methodology in contemporary tactical situations. Better. More academic. Less, I was completely wrong and a human proved it with a kitchen knife. His mandibles clicked softly as he saved the changes. In the hallway outside, Rolf was already pestering Jake with questions. So the optimal grip pressure for maximum cutting force would be? There is no optimal grip pressure. That's the point. But there must be a formula. A calculation. The formula is, hold it tight enough that you don't drop it, loose enough that you can move it. Everything else is practice. That's not a formula, that's barely even advice. Welcome to human combat doctrine. We've been disappointing people who wanted equations since forever. Pip bubbled something that came out as, I love everything about this conversation. Please continue forever. Much wisdom. Very sword. They turned the corner toward the residential section, passing other students who stared openly at the human carrying an unsheathed blade like it was the most normal thing in the world. Jake nodded at a few, ignored the rest. Hey Murdoch, Rolf said after a while. Yeah? Why did your grandmother really give you that sword? Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking about the spaceport, the crowd of humans shipping out to join the galactic military, the way his grandmother had pressed the katana into his hands with a look that said more than words could. She said the galaxy was full of species who'd forgotten what it meant to fight for survival, who'd gotten so good at technology that they'd forgotten the fundamentals. She said someone needed to remind them that the old ways still worked, and that humans were really good at the old ways. Was she right? Jake smiled, the kind of smile that had probably terrified people for 3,000 years. You tell me. You're the one who just watched me take down a war beast with a sharpened metal bar. Rolf's scales went thoughtful green. Your grandmother sounds terrifying. She's 5 feet tall and makes cookies that could choke a Vraxian. Still terrifying. Yeah, Jake agreed. She really is. They reached the residential wing. Pip branched off toward the liquid-compatible quarters, still bubbling about flails and medieval warfare. Rolf headed toward the reptilian sector, already pulling up holographic sword diagrams on his datapad because, of course, he needed to study stabbing things like it was a science. Jake went to his quarters, small and human standard and cluttered with the things he'd brought from Earth. Pictures, books, a coffee maker that technically violated station regulations but nobody had the heart to confiscate. He placed the katana carefully on its stand, by the window where it could catch the starlight from a dozen different systems. His communicator pinged. Message from home. From his grandmother. How's space treating you? Learn anything useful yet? Jake typed back. Thanks for the sword, Grandma. Turns out, 3,000 years of stabbing things is still relevant. Her response came back almost instantly. Of course it is. I'm not senile. I'm experienced. There's a difference. Don't forget to eat vegetables. Space food doesn't count. Jake laughed, set down the communicator, and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the galaxy was full of species with energy weapons, and faster-than-light travel, and technology that looked like magic. And somewhere on Earth, his grandmother was probably making cookies and sharpening kitchen knives, because some things never changed. Some things didn't need to. He touched the katana's handle once, a gesture of respect to 800 years of family history and 3,000 years of human stubbornness. Thanks, Grandma, he said to the empty room, to the sword, to the universe that was slowly learning that humans didn't become obsolete. They just got creative.